Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about the very first part of the historical investigation. We will be starting the project, so the very first part will be due in early January, kind of right after the break. But I wanted to give you some information now, that way in case you decide that you want to find some sources, and we'll get a chance to talk about this in class as well. But the very first part is called the Plan of Investigation. You can see that on the screen. The very first submission also includes a bibliography. In this case, you will have 8 sources. They may be similar sources to the last time, but the suggestion is that you want to keep enhancing throughout the year the sources that you use for this project. So, you're continually looking to find sources and also read or watch or in some way, take time to look at the information in those sources. I wanted to give you a sense of the whole historical investigation, even though by January we're really only looking at the plan of investigation. This very first part of the historical investigation is very brief, so it is in a sense like the best place to start because it's just a thinking through of your question and what it is you're going to be researching. It's the following pieces, the ones that we do in February and March and April, that are actually the much more challenging parts of the historical investigation. The very first part, the plan of investigation, is really designed for you to tell your reader, this is the question I'm pursuing, this is the reasons why I'm pursuing that question, and this is a little bit of the research I'm going to look at, and these are my sources that I'm going to be using. At least, mention of a few of the key sources. That's all the plan of investigation is. When you get to the summary of evidence, this is where you are actually compiling evidence that comes from all of your 8 sources. So you're sifting through 8 different sources, you're finding pieces of evidence, quoting it directly, paraphrasing it, citing it, and then compiling it. And what's unique about the summary of evidence is that it's organized by arguments. If you propose a question, such as the one we did in class a while ago, where you looked at, to what extent did Charlemagne unify his, empire. If we wanted to look at that question, you might have some evidence that says, yes, Charlemagne did unify his empire. He did this in the Carolingian Renaissance, he did this, and all of that evidence would kind of get attached to the idea that, yes, he did unify his empire. On the other hand, you might also have some evidence that's suggestive that he didn't unify his empire, or you might even have a third argument that maybe even says, perhaps there was, an attempt to try to unify his empire, but the attempt failed, right? You're kind of linking some of the evidence that you have to specific arguments so that you can visualize the evidence that exists for these various arguments. So you're not only collecting evidence that supports or negates your question, you're organizing that evidence to help you formulate potential answers to your question. You will be doing a section called the evaluation of sources. This will be a little familiar because in the 8 sources that you're going to use for this project, you will have an opportunity to do an OPVL on 2 of the sources. Okay, and again, this is not due in the first part. The first part will be exclusively the plan of investigation, but this is just giving you a sense of some of the later parts. And I did put a sample on Schoology done by a student from last year, a freshman, so you can just get an idea of a little bit of what the whole historical investigation looks like. There is a section, and the analysis and the conclusion are really the key sections in the HI. We do them later in the year. The analysis is where you get to speak in your voice. Okay, this is basically your assessment of the evidence that you present. If you have evidence that says Charlemagne really unified his kingdom, what might be the kind of your take on some of that evidence? Is the evidence strong? Do the arguments seem to be very, very strong? And what's some critique kind of that you might have if you don't think that that's really key? So it's your chance to look at arguments from all sides, to look at the evidence that supports those arguments, and perhaps to critique some of the evidence or the arguments. And some of this might come from your OPVLs, or it might come from the way that you consider some historical context, context, but generally students at BCA are very strong in this analytical section. It's a way of kind of critiquing and supporting some of the arguments that you see that exist. And think of this task for the analysis is almost like your opportunity if you listen to a debate and you had to make a decision in the debate. The analysis is the discussion that you have with your reader about how you arrive at a decision. That decision is formulated into a conclusion. Okay, the conclusion is brief for the HI. It's really a few sentences. How would you answer the question? It's either that you're advocating for one of the arguments, you might be rejecting all of the arguments, not one of them makes sense, or you might have a piece of one argument and a piece of another that kind of are part of your conclusion. Okay, so it can be a variety of things. One thing I'm going to recommend to all of you, many of you will need to work some more on your question before doing the plan of investigation. So this is like the first thing to do. Keep reading about your topic and trying to narrow your question. If you have a broad question, like what led to the American Revolution, something about all of World War II, or something about all of World War I, you're going to find that a very narrow question is going to enable you to be successful on the HI. To take a question like what led to the American Revolution, what's a way that you can narrow it? Well, you can think about, well, what might be one of the things that led to the American Revolution? I know taxes were like kind of part of this. People got ticked off. The colonists got ticked off about the taxes. Maybe that's something that led to the American Revolution. Even that is a little bit broad because there's so many taxes. Okay, what might I be able to do if I'm looking at all of the taxes? They all have different outcomes, and they might all have different historical context. They don't all come out at the same time. You know, the very last tax that's imposed might be more problematic because earlier taxes were already imposed. So I want to focus on one tax. Okay, so a question that I'm kind of evolving here might be, how did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the American Revolution? Okay, so in this case, I'm really looking at the causal effects of one particular tax. It happens to be on the earlier side in terms of Britain putting specific taxes in place. The Stamp Act is a tax largely on paper, so things like playing cards or whatever have a tax on them, and of course the colonists react to this. This question here, how did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the American Revolution, is more narrow. That's a good thing, but it still also needs to be a question that's both debatable. I don't want a how question because I want there to be multiple answers, okay? And I also want it to be measurable. How am I going to know if the Stamp Act led to the American Revolution? What am I looking for as a indicator of that? Okay, so this is going to lead me to some changes I can make in my question. I want to start out with the phrase "to what extent." Okay, that inevitably opens up a debate. Okay, to what extent? To a great extent, to not any extent, or to somewhere in between. Okay, so there's automatically a debate. This avoids listing every possible reason that the Stamp Act could have had something to do with the Revolutionary War. Okay, which could be a just giant bulleted list, and that's not an argument. Okay, we want to look at multiple sides, you know, of the argument. Okay, we might have a question that has multiple answers. Rather, some sample questions that you can start looking at. To what extent did X cause Y? Okay, where X and Y are something very narrow. To what extent was N a turning point, maybe in a particular event? To what extent did B, okay, whatever B is, increase economic growth in the United States in the 1950s? Okay, and if I want to think about how I can make something measurable, if I plug something into that very last question, to what extent did the building of the interstate highway system increase economic growth in the United States in the 1950s? I'm actually looking for some data, right, about how will I know that economic growth happened. Maybe I'm interested in figures related to GDP. And if I want to know how much did the interstate highway system actually increase economic growth, I might be looking for things like how much did cities that popped up along the interstate highway, you know, how much income did they generate in the society at the time, right? And how will I be able to measure that to convince my reader that that actually did happen or didn't happen? Okay, if I take my original question and I use some of this and I narrow and I use to what extent, this is what we come up with. To what extent did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts? Okay, in this case, rather than looking at how did the Stamp Act affect the entire Revolutionary War, which is just too big. There's just too many causes, short-term and long-term, direct and indirect, of the Revolutionary War. It's just like way too big. If we wanted to look at some of the more immediate effects of the Stamp Act, we could look at how much does it create a reaction in places like Boston, Massachusetts, that actually lead to action, that in some ways is going to shape the conversation about the Revolutionary War, or at least about forming the patriots' point of view. So with this question, I have, how much did the Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty? There's an implied aspect to this question, okay, that I might be looking at an argument, how much did the Stamp Act lead to the Sons of Liberty? But this question is also kind of a broad question at the same time. What really led to the Sons of Liberty? How much was it the 1765 Stamp Act, and how much was it something else? Okay, so in my later summary of evidence, I might have evidence that says, yes, the Stamp Act led to the Sons of Liberty, the creation of the Sons of Liberty. But I might also have information that says something else led to the Sons of Liberty. Maybe the creator of the Sons of Liberty, one of the first, participants, had some other beef with Great Britain, had some sort of other issue in Boston, and might have created the Sons of Liberty for a completely different purpose. Okay, so maybe it's a little bit of multiple things. Maybe the Stamp Act is part of the story, but not the only part of the story. Okay, so there's a lot of research and argumentation beyond just what's in the question, okay? And that's kind of key. In the plan of investigation, the task that you will be doing for the very beginning of January, you're going to do a few things, and then we'll look at the template, okay? First of all, you're going to give a brief description of the topic. This is going to be the first sentence or two of the plan of investigation. You're going to note the debate. You're basically suggesting to your reader, this is a question that historians debate, and these are the multiple sides of the debate, okay? You're going to describe the purpose of the investigation, which is essentially your research question. The purpose of the investigation is to find out how much the Stamp Act is related to the beginning of the Sons of Liberty. That's the purpose, okay? You're going to describe how you're going to go about your research, okay? This is basically one or two sentences that say, what topics are you going to research in order to find out the answer to your question? The very last sentence is going to be, what are the sources that you are going to use, okay? And you might not mention all of them because there'll be 8 of them and it'll be too much, but take your 2 best sources and describe how you're going to use them to note your actual, research. This is what your plan of investigation will look like, okay? It is very short. We also have it color-coded, and if you look at the assignment on Schoology, you will note that it is color-coded as well. It's a different example, but you can use the example in the paper on Schoology. It's called the template for the plan of investigation, and you can just kind of recreate your own plan of investigation in its place. The sentence that we have in yellow is basically the first 2 parts. I'm describing the Stamp Act, the British Parliament, yada yada, and I'm also noting the debate, okay? It's implied in this. In 1765, the British Parliament levied the unpopular Stamp Act on American colonists. From that, I know that colonists are reacting. They don't like the Stamp Act. In the following year, groups known as the Sons of Liberty began to form in the colony of Massachusetts, okay? This tells me that there is an interest I have in linking the creation of the Stamp Act to the creation of the Sons of Liberty, okay? It also leaves open that there is a possibility that the Sons of Liberty might have been created because of some other issue, because there's a year of time that separates these 2 events. This investigation will describe the Stamp Act, okay? So that's from the British to the colonists. What was the Stamp Act? When did it come about? What was happening in Boston when it came, okay? As well as examine Massachusetts colonists' reactions to it. I can use secondary sources. I can use primary sources. How did they react to it? Did they hate it? Did they like it? Did they not care? That will help. Furthermore, the paper will define define the Sons of Liberty and assess factors that led to its creation. Okay, so the research summary of evidence will have a variety of things that likely led to the Sons of Liberty. The purpose of this investigation is to assess the extent to which the 1765, it should say 65, Stamp Act led to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts. Okay, so you're repeating your question. The very last sentence is, what sources will I use?